Let's understand how environment as a concern came into picture in India. I mean, I'm going to give you an overview of environmental policies about how and from where it started. So, several environment protection legislation existed even before independence of India. However, the true trust for putting into force a developed framework came only after the United Nations Conference on Human Environment that is in Stockholm in 1972. A total of 26 principles were chalked out during the UNCHE in 1972, which were to be adopted and followed by participating nations. These principles became guiding principles for developing countries like India to frame environmental policies. The UNCHE was also instrumental in ensuring that global attention to environmental challenges is maintained through the decision of celebrating 5th June as World Environment Day. After this Stockholm Conference, the National Council for Environmental Policy and Planning was set up in India in 1972 itself within the Department of Science and Technology to establish a regulatory body to look after the environment related issues. This council later evolved into full-fledged Ministry of Environment and Forest, that is MOEF, in 1985, which today is the FX administrative body in our country for regulating and ensuring environmental protection and lays down the legal and regulatory framework. Today, this council is known as the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. So, these two particular events led to the development of lots of legislation related to environmental laws, policies in the following years. The government of India started passing various legislation to ensure that the quality of environment is maintained and to curb the damage. At that time, protecting the environment also became a constitutional mandate in India because, as a welfare state, India has committed to protect its environment for the protection of its citizens. The Indian Constitution contains specific provision for environmental protection. This provision is there under the chapters of Directive Principle of State Policy and Fundamental Duties. Like we can clearly see the intention of government to improve the environment at that time, and everything was moving fine up till here. But the gaps in these laws and acts were revealed by one of the greatest tragedies, a man made disaster in central India. We all are aware of Bhopal gas tragedy that occurred in 1984. And this Bhopal gas disaster led to increased environmental awareness and activism in India. This tragedy had played very important role to update the previous environmental laws that were prevalent in India. It is because of this disaster new environmental act was made cautiously, and that act was the Environment Protection Act passed in 1986, which was after 2 years of Bhopal gas tragedy. So, after this Bhopal gas disaster of 1984, the Indian government realized that existing environmental laws in India were insufficient. If we want to avoid such disaster from happening in the future, then there was a need for stronger and more powerful laws. This is why Indian government came up with the Environmental Protection Act in 1986. This act is very important because it is considered as an umbrella legislation. It fills many gaps in the earlier laws. As a whole, the objective of Environment Protection Act was to provide protection and improve the environment. Under this act, the Ministry of Environment and Forest was given overall responsibility for administrative and enforcing environmental laws in policies in India. It established the importance of integrating environmental strategies into all industrial development plans for the country. It has not always been effective. In many cases, economy has been a priority even at the cost of environment. But the Environment Protection Act is still an important legislation. It provides for coordination of activities of various regulatory agencies. This act adopted lots of new strategies to combat the environment issue prevalent in the country. At that time, for example, National Green Tribunal Court was established. So now let's quickly review all the major policies, laws, acts that was passed after the 1985 era. These are the major acts and policies which has been adopted by our Indian government for the protection, conservation of environment. The first act that was passed after 1985 was the Environment Protection Act of 1986. Soon after this, National Forest Policy was passed. This policy was the first environmental policy document in India that indirectly recognized the linkages between environmental and social concerns in terms of community rights to natural resources. The National Forest Policy of 1988 was strikingly different. Section 4.6 of the policy highlighted the symbiotic relationship between tribals and forests and the need to involve tribal community in the management of forests. It also emphasized the domestic requirement of firewood, fodder, and minor forest produce should be the first priority of forest management, not commercial or industrial needs. In that sense, it signaled a definite change of approach and was an indication what was to be possibly come. Next is the National Green Tribunal of 2010. It has been connected with the objective to provide for establishment of traditional green code for effective disposal of cases relating to environment protection and conservation. So these were some important environment legislations that have been passed in our country for the protection, conservation, preservation of our environment. India's current environmental policy is dominated by the country's landmark National Environmental Policy of 2006.